John Carreyrou, you brought to light in 2015 in an article in the Wall Street Journal something very wrong with Theranos, a blood testing startup, and its founder, Elizabeth Holmes. Elizabeth was charged just a few months ago with massive fraud by the SEC. What's next for her?
Well, potentially two things are going to happen in the next few months. One is that Theranos, which, believe it or not, is actually still a going concern, is going to run out of money, and its assets are going to be seized by Fortress Investment Group, the New York private equity firm that lent Elizabeth Holmes money at the end of last year. And Fortress will then liquidate the assets. It already has the patent portfolio as collateral to the loan. So very likely Theranos will cease to exist probably by the end of July, early August. The other thing that bears watching is the criminal investigation. There's been a parallel criminal investigation conducted by the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco for more than 2 years now. And my sources tell me that that investigation is drawing to a close and may well result in criminal indictments of Elizabeth Holmes and her ex-boyfriend, Sunny Balwani.
Do you think Elizabeth ultimately faces prison time?
It's certainly a possibility if they indict her. They would then, of course, have to prove their case at trial. And it's probably not a slam dunk case because, you know, she has shown her ability at convincing people and manipulating people, and so she'll present a sympathetic figure to a jury and possibly be able to manipulate a jury. The other thing that if prosecutors do indict her, that they'll have to overcome is the argument that her lawyers are sure to make, which is that she wasn't enriched by this fraud. And why was she not enriched? Because she never sold her shares. When the company was worth $10 billion in early 2015, she didn't sell any shares. So they're going to argue that as a result, she didn't profit from the fraud.
Well, that's an important point because I guess at that time when the company was worth $10 to $15 billion, her net worth was upwards of $5 billion. So
Right.
Is there any estimate in terms of how much money she made over this, say, 15-year period?
Well, my understanding is actually that the SEC levied a relatively small fine, which was $500,000, because that was essentially the amount of money that she had to her name. If she had made more money from Theranos, whether it be by selling shares or through a salary, they would have fined her more than that.
And we should point out you chronicle all of this in your new book, Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup. It's out today, so we'll watch for that. Elizabeth Holmes started the company at age 19. In a few lines, what was her motivation? What was she trying to do with Theranos, and what went so wrong?
Right. So she had a vision, and it was for a diagnostic device. At first, it was a wristband that would feature these microneedles that would draw your blood and diagnose instantaneously what ailed you, and then also instantaneously inject you with a drug, the appropriate drug to cure you. She and her co-founder quickly realized that vision for the wristband was science fiction, that it wasn't feasible, so they pivoted to essentially something derived from those portable blood glucose monitors, except she wanted it to be a device that could test for all blood tests, not just blood sugar. And so that meant a device that would be a lot more involved, a lot more complex.
And that was her pitch to Walgreens, which signed on for a huge deal with them.
Right, and so in 2010, now bear in mind this was 6 or 7 years into Theranos' life, she was still having trouble developing the technology, yet she went to Walgreens and she told Walgreens that she had the device, that it was ready, that it worked, and that it did the full range of tests on just a drop of blood. And that was actually when she made those assertions to Walgreens, it was not true. Not only was it not true then in 2010, it was not true 3 years later when she went live with the blood tests in Walgreens stores.
And when I'm reading the book, you know, there were issues as far back as 2007, 2008. Your article in the Wall Street Journal came out in 2015. Why did it take so long for someone to call a reporter about this?
Right. Well, I mean, Theranos had a culture of secrecy and fear that was enforced by Elizabeth's now ex-boyfriend, Sunny Balwani, who was the number 2 executive at the company, and made employees sign non-disclosure agreements. The threat of litigation was always in the air. Employees knew that Elizabeth had sued employees in the past. They knew that the outside counsel for the company was David Boies, arguably the most famous lawyer in America. And he was sort of a scarecrow. He gave credence to this specter of litigation if anyone said anything. And so, I believe people were silenced by this culture of fear and secrecy and by the lawyers who were so ever present.
And now she raised, what, $900 million over her tenure as CEO?
If you count the $65 million that Fortress put in at the end of last year, it's almost $1 billion.
So going back to the criminal investigation for a moment, is this a matter of, hey, she defrauded investors, allegedly, and this is why she should be prosecuted? Or is this a matter of, hey, this is just a startup that went bad, and that's how it goes sometimes in Silicon Valley?
Well, it's a startup it's a startup and a startup founder who overpromised and who hoped that eventually, the reality of the development of her technology would catch up with what she had promised years before. The problem is that not only did she raise money based on those promises that were never fulfilled, she also went live with those blood tests. So when you look at what charges prosecutors may bring if they decide to bring charges, certainly securities fraud would be one, but I believe another bucket of charges would be lying to federal officials. The inspectors who came to inspect the Theranos lab in late 2013 were not shown the part downstairs that had the Edison machines and the hacked Siemens machines. They were only shown the part upstairs with the regular analyzers. That's deceiving federal officials. And then I think if there are charges, it may also come to include Medicare fraud conspiracy charges.
When we look back at some of the biggest fraud in corporate America, obviously Enron comes to mind.
Right.
In your view, is there any reason to equate Enron to Theranos? Is there any connection there in your view?
Well, certainly Enron involved more money. At the time that Enron went down, it was the 7th largest company in the US. Theranos is just a startup in Silicon Valley, albeit one that defrauded investors out of $1 billion. But I would argue that the Theranos scandal is on par, actually, with Enron, because there's a component to it that the Enron story didn't have, which is that Theranos went live with blood tests that weren't reliable, that were faulty, and put patients in harm's way. And when I exposed the company, it was actually on the cusp of going national with its blood tests. It was about to roll them out to Walgreens' 8,000 other stores. And if that had happened, the chances that someone would have died from either a wrong diagnosis or an unnecessary medical treatment would have skyrocketed.
And when we talk about the $1 billion or so in funding, a good amount of that came from very high-profile investors. If you could name a few, that would be great. And also talk about the board and the advisors that she had, many of whom were also very high-profile.
Right. So, the board was a who's who of famous, former statesmen, George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry, who had been Secretary of Defense under Clinton, Sam Nunn, James Mattis, who's now our Secretary of Defense in the Trump administration. I could go on. And actually, this was one of Elizabeth's tactics, is she surrounded herself with people with prestigious reputations, and that gave her credibility. In terms of the high-profile investors who invested and who in part were sold on the company by this prestigious board, there's Rupert Murdoch, who actually controls the Wall Street Journal, my newspaper, who was the single largest investor, invested $125 million in Theranos. Also Betsy DeVos's family, our current education secretary, her family put in $100 million. The Coxes, the billionaire Cox family who control Cox Enterprises in Atlanta, they put in $100 million. Carlos Slim, the Mexican billionaire, put in $30 million.
And all that money's gone.
All that money is gone. It's gone poof. And a lot of it has gone to pay lawyer fees over the past 2.5 years.
So when I hear this list of prestigious names, I'm not hearing any doctors or folks with medical expertise. So it's a prestigious list, but it's not necessarily related to the core business. How big of a problem was that?
Right. I mean, she avoided venture funds with experience in medical technology and in healthcare like the plague. You know, she really stayed away from them, and she targeted these rich individuals and very wealthy families who were sort of, you know, you could crassly call them the dumb money. They're certainly not the smart money in the sense that they're not investors who do sophisticated due diligence and have teams of people to do that due diligence for them.
So on that note, was the Theranos frenzy in terms of the money that it raised, was that a symptom of Silicon Valley hype and a lot of the money that rushed into Silicon Valley over the past decade or so, and we see all these unicorn companies that are worth more than $1 billion?
Right, it absolutely was. I mean, what you've had happen in Silicon Valley over the past decade is this enormous flow of money, in part because the Federal Reserve kept rates at close to nothing to offset the effects of the devastating financial crisis a decade ago. And as a result, you had investors who went looking for returns elsewhere, and one of the places they went looking was Silicon Valley. That led to these enormous flows of money into the Valley ecosystem, and you had startup founders like Elizabeth Holmes who were able to pick and choose who their investors were and who were able to turn away investors who asked too many questions or who asked unpleasant questions.
And if I remember correctly in the book, she actually walked out of meetings that maybe didn't go her way.
Right. She walked out of a meeting in 2004 with a venture fund that actually had a lot of experience in medical technology, and you know, she was getting these probing technical questions from the partners around this conference table, and got more and more defensive, and after about an hour got up and left in a huff.
So has there been any noticeable change in how some of these private companies are valued, or at least changes in the VC community on how they're approaching some of this stuff?
I'd like to hope so. A friend of mine who works in our Silicon Valley bureau at the Journal says that every dinner he attends in the Valley, Theranos comes up as a cautionary tale, as an example of what can go wrong. So I think that this story has definitely left its mark. I think it will leave its mark even more if federal prosecutors file criminal charges, because that will be a signal that the Justice Department and the SEC, to a lesser extent, are no longer tolerating these shenanigans, and that this huge ecosystem, private ecosystem in Silicon Valley is no longer immune to, you know, the authorities and to law enforcement if wrongdoing gets committed.
And it's a much different situation, but we're certainly seeing the tech sector under pressure when it comes to those data security concerns. Certainly lawmakers are paying attention to this issue.
There's definitely a backlash right now against Silicon Valley and against tech, and Theranos is part of that.
Elizabeth Holmes and her idea of democratizing the blood test.
Right.
Was she onto something, and it just that the science wasn't there yet, and maybe it gets there someday?
She was definitely onto something. You know, a lot of people do not like to get their blood drawn. A lot of people dread having that big syringe, you know, inserted into their arm and having 5 tubes of blood drawn from them. And so to the extent that these capillary blood tests, these finger stick tests, could have made blood testing something that people were more willing to do more often, which would have potentially led to more timely diagnoses, I think it could have been a game changer. Unfortunately, you know, her technology wasn't there at all. By the time she went live with her blood tests in 2013, her mini lab, as she called it, was a malfunctioning prototype that was years from working. And so, you know, is the technology going to eventually get there? Possibly. But no one yet has managed to crack the nut of running dozens of tests off that little blood, especially blood that's from the finger, which is not the same as venous blood. Venous blood is pure, and there isn't the tissue and the cells that you get with capillary blood that interfere with tests.
You tried to interview Holmes many times to no avail.
I tried, before my first story was published in October 2015, I tried interviewing her for 5.5 months. And then on a regular basis since then, I've asked for interviews and I've been repeatedly turned down. And so I had to report and write this book without her participation.
What would you like to ask her if you had the opportunity?
I would ask her, how were you able to justify, how were you able to rationalize in your mind risking patients' health? How is that acceptable to you?
Was that serious of an issue? That serious of a technology?
Absolutely. I mean, nearly 1 million blood test results have been voided or corrected since my first stories came out. And so you have a lot of people who received a lot of flawed blood test results. And if the company had expanded nationally and its services had been available on every, at every Walgreens, on every street corner, then the chances that someone really would have gotten hurt would have multiplied.
It's quite a story. John Carreyrou, we appreciate you coming by to talk about it, author of Bad Blood, out right now.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.